so it stayed. Now what I'm getting at there is that it's possible to be able to measure the benefit foregone by bad decision making. The federal government funds about 125 literacy programs. Only about 20 of them work. If you put the money into the 20 that work, you would get 4 times as many people made literate each year. The cost of the status quo is tens of thousands of people who remain illiterate. We need to be able to put that on the shoulders of the decision makers so that those appropriators now know there's a consequence in human physical terms for the bad decisions that they're making. I've been invited next week to give testimony in front of the Senate, and the focus or the subject of that testimony is the American federal deficit going to bankrupt America? I'll give you a prelude. The answer is yes. But what we're doing is shipping the decision and the consequences on to future generations. Not going to happen during my lifetime. It's going to happen during the lifetime of some of you, the people here. It's certainly going to happen during the lifetime of your children. We're going to give them insurmountable barriers. We need to have politicians who say, balance the budget. The work that Newt Gingrich and the Republican Revolution did in the early 90s caused the surpluses in the middle of the Clinton administration. What a damn shame they squandered them. In 1994, for the first time in 23 years, after something like 10 years of reform, New Zealand showed its first surplus. At the same time, we passed something that was called the Fiscal Responsibility Act that made it very difficult for governments to run deficits in future. During the height of the reform process, New Zealand's level of indebtedness was about 68% of GDP. We're now into our 15th year of surpluses. We have paid off all of our international debt. We have paid off all of our local debt. We have a different retirement scheme to you, but our social security scheme is unfunded. There's no special tax to fund it. We've used surpluses to pay that forward to 2025. And now the very left of centre government is forced to have to give tax cuts because the surpluses are too large. Now, isn't that a nice state of events? Ireland, after 30 years of deficits and huge accumulation of debts, is now into its 11th year of surpluses and paying off its debt too. Now, one of the things that made it important for New Zealanders for this reform to occur was, what's happening to our young people? And the answer was they were leaving. And they were leaving to go to Australia, to go to Southeast Asia, to go to Europe or North America, and they weren't coming back. And people started to say, this used to be a great place to live, and we need to make it a great place to live again. And based upon creating the opportunity that would enable young people to have a career at home in New Zealand, we were able to put in place those changes. I'm going to tell you a little story just to end and then take some questions from you. And this is just to show what happens when you actually adopt a questioning mind. On one occasion, the Department of Transportation came to a cabinet committee that I was a member of, and they wanted to increase the fees for driver licensing. And we said to them, why? And they said, government policy now is that we have to fully recover the cost of these fees, and we're not doing it. And we said to them, why do we actually do it? And they clearly thought that was a stupid question and said, well, sir, everybody needs a driver's license. And I said, yes, but I got mine when I was age 15. Tell me, what is there about the renewal process that tests my competency as a driver? That was a harder question. And they said, well, we need to get information about you. I said, that's about identity cards, and the government hasn't got a policy on having identity cards. So that doesn't wash. And they said, but we test your eyes. I said, you test your eyes with somebody who's totally incompetent to test my eyes. But the law also requires that if I go to an ophthalmologist or I go to the doctor and I've got to wear glasses, the doctor needs to inform the Department of Transportation immediately. That's in the law. So why do you do it again when I get my driver's license? No good answer. We said to them, we'll give you 10 days. Come back in 10 days and tell us why we have a driver license renewal program. They came back in 10 days and they said, we can't actually find a good reason for doing it. So we gave people lifetime driver's licenses and they don't need to renew them until they're age 74, after which they have to have an annual medical to show that they're physically fit to drive. Post 9/11, you've got to get a new photo every 10 years. You see, for 90 years, we had done something because it had always been done that way, without anybody asking that question. I've had to renew my driver's license in the United States. Nobody tested a darn thing about whether or not I could drive. You see, asking basic questions often produces for you those results. The hardest lesson that I learned in politics was this, that sometimes the solution can be found by just doing nothing. Just leave it alone and it will come right. People will find the solution. I just wish to God that the government had left the subprime crisis alone back in last August, and I don't think it would have been anywhere near as bad as it is today. You see, what they're actually doing is that they are rewarding and encouraging bad behaviour. If in 1987 they hadn't bailed out the banks over the savings and loan crisis, probably the subloan problem would not have occurred, because bankers would have been more cautious about the experience that they've been through in 1987. So learning to do nothing is one of the important traits of being a good politician. Finally, leadership. The great leaders that I like to think about weren't really very popular people. Sir Winston Churchill was crusty, difficult, argumentative, unpleasant, and a bully. But boy, he's exactly the person you wanted when you were in trouble. The British dumped him immediately after the war, and then had to pull him back 5 years later to try and rescue Britain as the socialists had cascaded it into a terrible economic plight. Ronald Reagan, a different kind of person because he was liked. But what he had was a firm grip on principle, and he wasn't going to be shifted. He didn't want to know the details. That's wrong, we're not going to do it. I love what he did over the air traffic controllers. I talked to Jasper Weinberger once, and he said, and I asked him about that event, and he said, we were petrified. And Ronnie just kept saying, fire them. Just fire them. We can't do that, Mr. President. He said, don't fire them. So he said, we went ahead and fired them, and we said to him, you know, you're doing the right thing, Mr. President, we're right behind you. But he said, we didn't tell him how far behind him we really were. You know, nothing bad happened. One of the first things that Margaret Thatcher did in the United Kingdom was the Welsh coal miners threatened to go out on strike. And she said to them, go out on strike, I don't care, we don't need you anymore. They'd done that with every Conservative government since the Second World War. So they went on strike. 2.5 years ago, I saw a little article in the paper saying that the last striking Welsh coal miner died. You see, time had passed them by and they didn't realise that. The other thing that Margaret Thatcher did was that she was very much into moving government activity back into the private sector, and she started a lot of privatisation. Most governments try and go touchy-feely around that issue. We're doing it for economic efficiency, we're doing it for all of these reasons. Not Margaret Thatcher. What she said was, my intention is to create a property-owning democracy. No apologies, that's the right thing to do. And she was right about it. People didn't necessarily like her, but they respected her for the leadership that she put in place. And between her and Ronald Reagan and the Pope, we have them to thank for the demise of the Cold War, because they had the courage to challenge something that nobody else was prepared to challenge. That's leadership. We need more of it.